Good afternoon. I am Gregory Washington, the president of George Mason University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Russia's war on Ukraine in a historical perspective. Our Russian and Eurasian Studies program developed this 12-part series as part of a course Mason faculty are teaching on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The goal of this series is to present the work of 12 scholars and writers from around the world. Their insights help us to understand the historical relationship between Russia and Ukraine, the invasion itself, and the remarkable resistance of the Ukrainian people. Through the perspective of these historians, we are better able to comprehend the war in Ukraine in a broader context. This series is an illustration of how humanities research in a public research university can create knowledge, spur discussion, and expand understanding of complex global issues. We appreciate your viewership of this series, and we are proud that George Mason University can bring it to you. Enjoy.
Well, thank you, President Washington. I'm Professor Steve Barnes. I'm director of the program in Russian and Eurasian Studies and associate professor of history here at George Mason University. Helping me out today also is Jessica Dotrieve, who is a PhD candidate in history here at George Mason and is my teaching assistant in this course. I want to welcome you to the second in our ongoing series, Russia's War on Ukraine in Historical Perspective, as we seek out each Monday to understand how history allows us to better make sense of this war. In this series, I've invited you into my online classroom this semester to listen into an incredible array of experts who will share their thoughts from collectively many decades of research, teaching, and thinking about history. These events are made possible due to support from the program in Russian and Eurasian Studies, the Department of History and Art History, the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, all parts of our George Mason University community. We're trying to build an online discussion of the events in the series on Twitter. Please use the hashtag RWOU, standing for Russia's War on Ukraine, to share your reactions to any of our speakers. Additionally, if you check my Twitter feed with the hashtag we've adopted for this series, you'll find links to some of the readings and films assigned in this course, including a couple of great articles by today's speaker. I come to you today in a moment of sadness, having seen the traumatic images of bodies exhumed from mass graves in the cities and towns liberated by the Ukrainian army in the last 2 weeks. These images, so reminiscent of others from the most criminal moments in history over the course of the last century, help us to understand why so many Ukrainians will never accept the abandonment of their people on still occupied territories for what would, it seems, prove only an illusory and temporary peace. Granted, the Putin regime seems to show no indications that they offer anything more than continued suffering, launching attacks on civilian populations and infrastructures, and a frustrated lashing out over the losses meted out to his armies. At this moment, it is important that we continue to support Ukraine. And I'll ask again that you consider making donations to Razum for Ukraine, which works on the ground in Ukraine to provide humanitarian relief and recovery assistance. In Russia, we have over this weekend seen bombastic frustration from its most genocidally inclined social media and television figures. While Alla Pugacheva, an enormously popular singer since the later decades of the Soviet era, someone equated by some to a Russian Oprah or Madonna, spoke out against the war, albeit without ever once mentioning the suffering of Ukrainians. Could this prove to be any kind of turning point in Russian public attitudes toward the war? How did we get to the Russia we have today? Was there ever a chance for post-Soviet Russia to take a different path than the one that brought us Putin's authoritarianism and wars. While our series will rightfully focus a great deal on Ukraine, it is also critical for us to understand Russia and some aspects of its history to understand this war. With that in mind, I invited a longtime friend and colleague to speak to us today, someone with whom I've had countless conversations over the years, conversations from which I always emerge a little bit smarter. Someone who, through her writings and television appearances, has shown a knack for speaking to public audiences. Today's speaker is Cynthia Hooper from the College of the Holy Cross. Cynthia has spent many years living and researching in a wide variety of Russian cities, not just Moscow, but also St. Petersburg, Nizhny Novgorod, and Samara. She's been focused since the beginning of the war on Russian media strategies and has written for the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and for The Conversation. Cynthia also speaks broadly to places like CNN and NPR, but also to businesses, consulting companies, and public organizations who are looking to better understand Russia and this war. Please submit your questions at any time using the Q&A feature on Zoom, and I'll ask as many as I'm able to Professor Hooper when she finishes her talk. And with that, Cynthia, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Steve, and hello, everybody. It's an extraordinary honor to have been asked to take part in this tremendous lecture series that Steve spent so much of his summer carefully preparing. I really want to stress to the audience listening that I am very much a warm-up act, that I feel a little bit like a street busker when the Rolling Stones are just waiting in the wings. I mean, maybe the Rolling Stones of history and journalism, but still, the greats are going to be here on this stage starting next week. So be sure to keep coming back for more. Also to start, it can't have escaped the attention of many of you that I have the rather unenviable task of kicking off this series with a talk on, of all things, Russia, right after Steve promised last week that we would be shifting the focus to Ukraine. There's an irony in that, definitely, although I think the order of the early speakers may be more accidental than intentional. All I can say is that while the study of this war doesn't have to always begin in Moscow, it is important to try to understand the bad guys in any global conflict. I also have to say there is great sorrow and regret for me personally in having to talk about Russia today in such terms as a modern-day perpetrator of mass sustained atrocity. Yes, the person of Putin is to blame for starting this war, but it is in its 7th month now, and it cannot simply be explained in terms of a leader and his small coterie of amoral, self-enriched, violent, and not very smart associates who do whatever they want to do while an entire disenfranchised and thus blameless society looks on helplessly in fear. We have been critiquing that kind of straightforward state versus society totalitarian model of history for a good long time now in other contexts. As someone with Russian family and friends, it also pains me greatly to think of them, even in some kind of abstract collective sense, as perpetrators. I myself don't like the idea of being implicated in everything my own US government says and does. But when this war is over, we are going to have to explore tangled questions of culpability and collaboration, and that will be difficult. Right now, I think many of us who lived through the Gorbachev era, or who, like Steve and myself, met for the first time in the Russian archives in the 1990s, towards the end of the Yeltsin years, are still struggling with a more basic emotional and maybe to some degree even selfish feeling of loss. Are we mourning something real or something that never actually existed? How did we move from the openness and indeed sometimes the craziness of those days to the discovery of mass graves and torture chambers in places like Izum this weekend? I personally still can't quite believe the fact that former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, heralded as Time magazine's Man of the Decade in December of 1989, was recently laid to rest in a funeral so different from the one that took place in Britain this morning, without any high-profile foreign guests, and amid a sense of failure. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is not to explain the high politics of Vladimir Putin's Kremlin, or to talk about the men who last February made deliberate, eminently avoidable decisions to launch a massive attack on Ukraine in the expectation of blitzkrieg success. But I would like to speak just a bit about Russian society and its large-scale quiescence in the face of this war. For many months, the Kremlin has been able, at least until now, to keep police officers policing, reporters reporting, workers working. Meanwhile, it's hard to say what people actually believe. Poll numbers supporting the war are consistently high, but the respondents are also highly self-selective. Back in March, opposition figure Maxim Katz commissioned a poll on public attitudes, only to report that of 31,000 respondents who answered their phones, 29,400 immediately hung up once they'd heard what the subject of his survey was. However, there's also no doubt that the annexation of Crimea in 2014 had wide mass support, and that Vladimir Putin, throughout his 20+ years in power, has also wielded a substantial amount of more or less authentic popularity. Trying to account for this degree of, if nothing else, acquiescence to central policies, particularly in light of the war today, has led to a lot of discussion of Russia as if it were somehow exceptional, but in a very negative way, singularly and inescapably deformed. In a recent Twitter feed, political philosopher Gregory Yudin described his sense of contemporary Russia as a society made up of three groups: a minority group of radicals, a minority group of dissenters, and a large passive majority of what he termed laymen, people anxious to bury themselves in an illusion of normalcy, avoid conflict, and shield themselves as much as possible from the reality of the war. In German historiography, Detlef Peukert termed this behavior a retreat into the private sphere. This social topography is interesting, but so too were many of the comments posted by Yudin's readers. One said, quote, "Can I summarize? It's basically 80% morally completely rotten people in Russia. If the majority want to lap up soap operas instead of standing up against their terrorist regime, I call it a rotten group of people." Of course, these are heated words, but the back and forth in the comments reminded me very much of the historiography debates that flourished in the 1990s about Nazi Germany. Was there something specific to the Germans that allowed them to become perpetrators of genocide? Asked Daniel Goldhagen in a book entitled Hitler's Willing Executioners. Or were Germans fundamentally no different from anyone else? And could we all perhaps be capable of committing atrocity for reasons as simple as the desire to conform, as Christopher Browning suggested in a book aptly titled Ordinary Men? Right now, because we're all so angry, it feels as if a lot of analysis is shading in the Goldhagen direction. Various of what I like to call eternal Russia arguments are shaping a great deal of public debate. Frustrated Russian exiles are turning to a staple of 19th century Slavophile versus Zapadniki debates to argue that Russia has been perverted and inoculated to violence since its very beginnings as a state, getting a 200+ year Mongol invasion and then a rise of a Muscovy kingdom ruled by leaders like Ivan the Terrible, while the rest of Europe, including Ukraine, got the Renaissance. The greatest historians in our field are taking on political scientists like John Mearsheimer to argue that even if certain events of recent years had worked out differently, above all, even if NATO had not been expanded, Russia would still be where it is today. They speak of historical patterns and internal processes, of, quote, soaring ambitions that have exceeded the country's capabilities throughout the centuries, as if this continuity of aspiration were itself a deterministic force, independent of and more powerful than the agency of individuals. And finally, there's a lot of excellent scholarship, including recent biographies of Putin and his people, that suggests that the Soviet Union never really collapsed at all, and that there were deep continuities of personnel, bureaucratic practice, and institutional power that crushed efforts to build mechanisms of independent oversight or transparency. These in particular are fascinating works, in part because though focused on continuity, they also acknowledge contingency and adaptation to new situations, concepts, and technologies. Obviously, I too think that Russian history is filled with continuity. In my personal opinion, a very important and persistent problem for Russia across the years has been the unwillingness of any of its leaders to allow themselves to be bound by law, including laws that they themselves choose to set in motion. This failure to institutionalize and routinize law as a check on autocratic or bureaucratic power, and the role of law instead as an unpredictable instrument of the executive, is as central to understanding the workings of Russia today as it was to understanding the reigns of the czars. At the same time, I think we do ourselves a disservice in relying so greatly on ideas of inalterable otherness to explain the shape of contemporary Russia. This is particularly true when you consider recent analysis of Russia in comparison to that of Ukraine. Recent Ukrainian history, which you will thankfully hear a lot more about in the coming weeks, is punctuated by rapid change, even as the country has been plagued by a number of longue durée challenges. It is odd to attribute the possibility of transformation to one place, but not to another. And if you are going to do that, then your analysis needs to be more specific than just, well, it's always been that way. Certainly, and this is what I'd like to spend the rest of my talk discussing, we, meaning much of the Russian scholarly establishment, had different expectations for Russia 25 or 30 years ago, and thus deployed different analytic frameworks in talking about the relationship of its present to its past. For example, in 1989, we suddenly saw the triumph of democracy everywhere. I was lucky enough to have lived in Germany during that time and to have witnessed 2 years of tumultuous change in Eastern Europe that came to be symbolized above all in photos of jubilant citizens broaching the divisions of the Berlin Wall, that physical embodiment of Cold War enmity. It is by now cliche to say that everyone who experienced that moment was engulfed by a sense of wonder and possibility. And this was just one of a series of what became known as largely peaceful velvet revolutions, where citizens contributed to ending the Communist Party's monopoly on power in Poland, Hungary, Germany, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania. Now, I titled my talk today, "What Went Wrong with Russia?" not only because that's a question that students and alumni ask me all the time, but also in part because I wanted to draw attention to the way that question, in and of itself, is the product of a particular set of assumptions. It not only suggests that something in Russian development did go wrong, such that the country broke away from the path that certainly we Americans wanted it to take. But the question of what went wrong also harkens back to this Berlin Wall moment and to the idea that 1989 marked a critical, phenomenal, victorious, and dare I say in the minds of many, a US-led turning point in 20th century history. This tendency to take 1989 as a pivotal moment, signifying the triumph of liberal capitalist democracy, was widespread. Our scholarly and political establishments jumped on the idea that one system, our system, had been acknowledged as superior, and that all countries were at some stage in a shared single path towards its realization. One political scientist coined the term end of history to refer to this process of allegedly natural and inevitable global homogenization. This way of thinking ignored two things right off the bat. First, people's power was not ascendant everywhere, and velvet revolutions weren't becoming some kind of global norm. On June 4th, 1989, China crushed protesters who had been demonstrating for almost 2 months in Tiananmen Square, and that country's communist power most certainly did not subsequently relinquish power. At the time, however, this fact did not trouble end of history enthusiasts, who explained the crackdown as an unfortunate exception to the democratization paradigm. China just needed a couple more protests, a little more time. Needless to say, they were wrong. They were wrong too in a second area. 2 years after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union disintegrated. There again, we, meaning many Americans, tended to conflate 1989 with 1991. We glossed over the fact that the actual breakup of the USSR was not the result of people's power as much as it was instead the drunken and self-interested act of 3 men, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, making decisions about the global world order from the top down. The step that Yeltsin and Kravchuk and Shushkevich took on December 8th to dissolve the Soviet Union was so spontaneous that when Yeltsin called President Bush to explain it, and Bush asked what would happen to the Soviet nuclear arsenal, Yeltsin answered that they just hadn't figured all that out yet. Now, I admit this decision meant something very different for Ukrainians than it did for Russians. These histories are not identical. And I mention this moment not at all to suggest that the creation of an independent Ukraine in 1991 did not reflect the popular will at the time, which was rapidly shifting in favor of autonomy amid a growing winter economic crisis. However, I do want to point out that none of these 3 leaders felt particularly constrained by democratic process. Nonetheless, anxious to believe democracy ascendant, many scholars, journalists, and politicians chose to read Yeltsin as a Democrat to a far greater extent than his actions deserved. During the attempted coup against Gorbachev in August of 1991, CNN rented out the hotel across the street from the Russian White House, the country's parliament building, and portrayed Yeltsin as a hero in similar terms to those they had used to describe earlier freedom fighters in Tiananmen Square. Repeating that Yeltsin had promised to barricade himself in the White House until democracy prevailed, even if that meant he starved to death, journalists failed to notice that at least one of the back exits to the parliament building was still open and doing rapid business with Moscow's first Pizza Hut, which continued to deliver pies throughout the purported siege. Yeltsin was definitely not going hungry. This was most definitely not the case 2 years later, when Yeltsin, in a horrifying role reversal, refused to recognize an impeachment vote by his parliament, which was in 1993, full of delegates disillusioned with the president's shock therapy economic reforms. This time, it was Russian parliamentarians who holed up in the White House to protest Yeltsin's illegal actions, which included repudiating the country's constitution and declaring extraordinary executive powers. Ultimately, Yeltsin ordered tanks to shell his recalcitrant lawmakers into submission. At least 147 people were killed. But Clinton administration officials, by and large, held their tongues, feeling that it was better to accept the anti-democratic actions of an ally, in this case Yeltsin, in order to avoid the election of someone more hostile to US interests, or above all, someone opposed to capitalist reform. US Ambassador Thomas Pickering wrote Washington to say, were Yeltsin to have failed to do what he did, there was a good chance that there would have been another effort at the top to return Russia to communism. I cannot but believe that would have resulted in greater bloodshed and a long civil conflict. Another 3 years later in 1996, and Yeltsin, by that point notorious for an array of inebriated public antics, again faced overwhelming opposition, entering a presidential election with only single-digit citizen support. But Yeltsin asked the US for help, and Bill Clinton promised him money and public relations expertise, as did a coterie of freshly minted Russian oligarchs. Ultimately, despite official spending caps of $3 million per party, the Yeltsin campaign is estimated to have poured at least $140 million into re-election efforts. And such was the US lack of shame at what it was doing since after all, it was defending Russia from a resurgence of communism, that in 2003, a Hollywood comedy starring Jeff Goldblum and Liev Schreiber was made about American meddling. Called Spinning Boris, the movie celebrates the actions of 3 US public relations consultants who end up in crazy Moscow, assigned to get Yeltsin a win by, quote, teaching the Russians to play dirty and putting an American spin on Russia's first election. How did he pull off the biggest upset in election history? The trailer asks, referring to Yeltsin. The good old American way. Now, this is not to say that the US is to blame for the evolution of Russia, but more or less openly interfering in elections, failing to condemn extra-legal usage of force, and showing contempt for democratic and legal process, as well as for the popular will, did have consequences. Not only could the Putin regime turn instances of US hypocrisy and US meddling into powerful propaganda tropes in later years, but our actions in Russia can actually be said to have furnished a sort of beginner's guide model for early Russian political attitudes and expectations towards Ukraine. Now, I know that for today, Steve's class, which is after all the primary audience for this talk, read an article about the economic story of the 1990s in Russia, one which began with the country's overnight shift on January 2nd, 1992, from communism to capitalism. And I just have to add, because I'm a Gorbachev fan, that Gorbachev, for the record, had before his ouster proposed a much more gradual 500-day transition. In any case, your article describes contemporary Kremlin efforts to entrench a negative collective memory of the 1990s and to draw on this memory as a source of legitimacy for the Putin regime. Very, very interestingly, the author mentions that sociological surveys taken back during the actual time of people in the 1990s, quote, suggest that among the general public, the mass idea that this decade was terribly hard took shape retrospectively, and that views at the time about the experiences people were going through actually seemed to vary widely. This is a very good point. Truly, many young Russians welcomed a world of opportunity and change during the Yeltsin years. Thousands of small and medium-sized businesses were privatized in what many IMF workers involved in the process recall as the most meaningful years of their lives. But the hardships that many citizens experienced were also very real and were often dismissed or underestimated by foreign advisors and especially by Russian architects of reform who were perceived domestically to have close US ties. The actual extent of corruption, violence, and for many educated professionals or responsible factory workers, sudden poverty is hard to quantify. Soviet gold reserves and foreign currency accounts disappeared overnight as the Communist Party elite engaged in what one economist has infamously termed the Pyrrhization of Russia, a mad and frenzied scramble for ownership of property, all of which had been previously held in the hands of the state. In this struggle, the boundaries between criminal and official merged. In January of 1994, Izvestia reported that the Russian mafia controlled 70 to 80% of all private business in baking. In 1995, oligarch Boris Berezovsky boasted that he and 6 other top businessmen controlled 50% of the Russian economy. Even in 2001, almost a quarter of the national budget was estimated to be disappearing into the pockets of upper-level decision makers. Meanwhile, ordinary people lost all security as inflation hit 2,250% in 1992, and the ruble proved notoriously difficult to stabilize. Russian farmers lost 75% of their dairy cows. Male life expectancy, already a low 63.4 years, fell by more than 6 years between 1991 and 1994 to hit 57.4. When Yeltsin made a surprise resignation speech on December 31st, 1999, it included an apology to the Russian people. Now, We all know that from the very beginning of his presidency, Putin positioned himself as a counter to Yeltsin and the Yeltsin years. Sober rather than drunk, fit rather than incapacitated, offering stability rather than turbulence, controlling the hyper-rich, the oligarchs, rather than being controlled by them. But what I wish your article had addressed a bit more is the fact that, in quote, framing the 1990s as a collective trauma, Russian officials today are not trying to condemn either capitalism as a system or the specific actions of former communist or KGB operatives who were such major agents of corruption. Instead, they focus on portraying some kind of fraudulent or deliberately damaging process of transition they describe as having been inflicted on the country by others, a process, so the narrative goes, that was engineered by people outside of Russia, i.e. Americans, who were anxious for the country to be reduced and diminished. This domestic focus on Western conspiracy has grown to the point that elementary school history textbooks now list 3 times that Russia has been in danger of annihilation in the modern era. Along with Napoleon's invasion of 1812 and Adolf Hitler's invasion of 1941, they now additionally reference a more covert Western or US-led attempted subversion of the nation in 1992. Today, initiatives like the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, which was designed to secure and dismantle Russian nuclear weapons, are discussed as quasi-special ops efforts by US intelligence to strip the Russian nation of its most valuable resources. Of course, like all good propaganda, there is always a small kernel of truth in every distortion. Few Americans know, for instance, that for 20 years, from 1993 to 2013, 10% of our country's electricity came from dismantled Russian nuclear warheads obtained through that program. Facts like these feed into this propaganda idea that the US tried to undermine Russia during the 1990s and bring the country to its knees, but that under Putin, Russia rose back up from defeat and began to fight back. Even Gorbachev himself sadly reproduced aspects of this narrative, expressing in his final years regret about Western choices made after the triumph of 1989. In November of 2014, speaking at the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, he blamed the West for disregarding Russian interests such that the country was being pushed into acts of aggression, obviously referencing the annexation of Crimea that had taken place earlier that year. He said, quote, "The euphoria and triumphalism of 1989 went to the heads of Western leaders. Taking advantage of a weakened Russia and lacking a counterweight, they claimed monopoly leadership and domination of the world." Despite having many times criticized Putin publicly for his lack of tolerance for civil liberty, Gorbachev then praised the president for, quote, "protecting Russia's interests better than anyone else." Now, this narrative of Russian victimization is a symbolic one. It is not an objective truth, but it is a narrative that holds great power. In regard to the original question of my talk, what went wrong with Russia, there are all manner of possible nuts and bolts answers, many of which have little to do with US actions and how those actions were either perceived at the time or remembered retrospectively. Just to toss out a few examples, leaders could have endorsed a more gradual transition to capitalism, placed stronger emphasis on rule of law, maybe implemented a lustration program like that imposed in the Czech Republic, where members of the communist security services were barred from holding numerous positions of authority for almost a decade. But there's no denying that the US did play a key role in the transition years, and that it was perceived as playing an even bigger one by most Russians. Given that fact, the US government should have tried harder to follow its own best practices. Today, analysts are fond of saying that the Russian people are brainwashed in support of the war against Ukraine. That's debatable. Maybe that's an issue we can discuss more in questions, but certainly some propaganda talking points have greater traction than others. And in my opinion, US leaders have failed long before 2014 to take seriously just how widespread suspicion of Western motives is, and thus how much of an ideological weapon that suspicion can become. Under Soviet dictatorship, Russians were not a particularly gullible or credulous citizenry. Archival documents show that many, if not most, ordinary people were aware of censorship and government messaging. They didn't just blindly swallow whatever slogans they were fed, or at least they were aware of the process. They were aware that they were being fed them. Today, it's hard to believe that there are not at least that they are not at least equally cognizant of the fact that their government-controlled television is likely presenting only one particular and, shall we say, highly sanitized version of the Ukraine war. But while many Russians may not fully trust their own state's media, they certainly do not trust ours. It is this idea of Western unfairness towards Russia that is almost axiomatic. And just as many agreed that the West tried to undermine Russia in the 1990s, so too do they accept the offensive idea that there was no Ukrainian identity markedly different from a Russian one without some kind of nefarious Western encouragement from the outside. According to this logic, the US deployed foreign ideas of shock therapy and national political identity tactically, using them as tools of power to weaken Russia at US expense. Promulgating concepts of Ukrainian separateness thus becomes just one more tactic in a long tradition of superpower struggle for dominance in the Black Sea. But even if you agree with this analysis I've just presented here, there's still a big so what question to be asked. Who cares about all this lying propaganda? The Russians are killing people, so why don't we focus on fighting them rather than on trying to understand them? I get that. But the fact is that someday, barring great global cataclysm, Ukraine is going to win this war, and that moment might come a lot sooner than we had dared hope. But Russia is also not going to cease to exist. What happens then? As Ukraine's permanent representative to the UN recently pointed out, it is utterly wrong to believe that we should celebrate our victory on the day or the day after Russia is defeated militarily in Ukraine. Because when it happens, and it will happen, it will be just the beginning of a very, very long process, the process of returning Russia to developing a democratic nation. He pointed out that after World War II, West Germany had to go through a period of denazification, and he suggested that Russia should be de-Putinized. Others have mentioned reparations and war crimes trials. But at some point, we will also have to try again to win hearts and minds. Keith Gesson, in a second article you were also assigned to read for today, called Was It Inevitable?, concludes his piece by noting, someday the war will end, and someday after that, though probably not as soon as one might hope, the regime in Russia will have to change. There will be another opportunity to welcome Russia again into the concert of nations. Our job then will be to do it differently than we did it this time in the post-Soviet period. Thanks. That's the end of my official talk, but if you just bear with me, I wanted to share with you all one image that has meant a lot to my family as we talk about this war and contemplate the future. I know this is nothing special. It's a CD cover of a recording that was made of Beethoven concertos in 1969. And this is probably very, very corny, but for us, it really means something because this recording is made in the middle of Cold War by Soviet and German Austrian musicians. It symbolizes a bridging of East versus West. It's also made less than 25 years before the end of the Second World War. And Herbert von Karajan was a member of the Nazi Party. And for some reason it's not showing, but David Oistrakh was Jewish. So it symbolizes also reconciliation and forgiveness after the cataclysm of World War II. And then today, I think it has a added poignancy because if you look at the Soviet musicians, the star Soviet musicians who were involved in this performance, where do they come from? Well, Mstislav Rostropovich was born in Azerbaijan. Sviatoslav Richter and David Oistrakh were born in Ukraine. And they're playing Beethoven's music, and that's one of the few art forms that's really allowed to transcend its person and place of origin and stand as an almost a universal symbol of hope and inspiration. So on that note, may we all be able to come together again. And thank you.
Cynthia, thanks very much. So much to think about. So many questions that I have. We have a lot of questions coming in. Please continue to add them. I'll do my best to hold back on the conversations that you and I will no doubt have in the weeks to come, and to prioritize questions that the audience has. But let me ask one myself first, which is you talked about what I think is a critical sort of broad issue for us as historians, which is how can we as historians understand historical moments while we're within those very historical moments? I think that's one of the things that I've been struggling with, and I can see that it's something that you've been thinking about as well. And I know, we've texted back and forth a lot, you and I, about these kinds of questions. But I wonder if you could just think a little bit more for me about what it might have been like to try to understand, say, Stalinism, if you were living through Stalinism, but you were a historian. Like how does the luxury of time allow us as historians, who we tend, right? We tend as a profession not to want to talk about the last 10 or 20 years, right? We like to have a little time. You look at most of the work that our colleagues are writing, we kind of slowly follow behind history as it goes on. And yet I think we're called, and I think we feel that calling, you and I, and many of us sort of morally in this moment, to try to help people understand. So what are the dangers, the pitfalls, the lessons that we can learn as historians about where we might make mistakes in trying to understand a moment while we're living through it? I know it's this sort of big conceptual question, but I just wonder your thoughts a little bit before I get into some more specific questions.
Well, I have lots of responses floating around in my head. First of all, I think we have, a great responsibility and opportunity to students. I mean, interest is so high, and this is a time where people are very dedicated to crossing over some of these like sort of generic divisions, like say between politics and business and academia and journalism, and all kind of collaborating together and trying to understand what's going on. And certainly students are fascinated, and they're fascinated not just in like current events, but also in history of Imperial Russia, history of nationalities, history of the Soviet Union. So in that way, it's a great bonus. I do think that we also have to be very upfront about our own fallibilities and our own positions of luxury. It's not just like when you ask about what would it like to be like a historian in the time of Stalin or in the Third Reich, it also makes a big difference, like, well, whether I'm actually like in the Third Reich or if I'm in the United States, like looking at the Third Reich. And I think that that's actually where I believe in trying to encourage empathy, and I've always sort of, been much more in favor of the Christopher Browning sort of idea that, like, there but for the grace of God go I. I've done a lot of research on the Stalin era Great Terror, and to me, the most moving documents are the ones that I was able to find in places like Nizhny Novgorod, where you're able to look at party meetings that police officers had over the course of a couple of years, like every few months, like full transcripts of these meetings. And, they're police officers, so of course they suck, right? It's easy to, like, they're perpetrators, we hate them. And they're doing terrible things, but if you're actually reading these transcripts, and my Russian was so bad then that I was actually just like sitting there really reading them word for word. You see, like, they know each other, they go to each other's birthday parties, they, some of them are friends, some of them are resentful about, like, not being in the top circle of friendship, and like bring up in meetings like, well, you never invited me to, like, your daughter's christening, so I was never really, like, in the inner circle. And it's amazing. I mean, it's like a history department, right? It's an intimate group of people that work together daily. And you see how over time, due to all kinds of, signals that are coming in from different other party centers and rumors and encouragements, and that these people are getting nervous, and then they're starting to, like, attack one another. And then they're starting to talk publicly about how they're ready to, like, attack their own brothers and sisters. Like, they're denouncing their closest relatives, and they're apologizing for not having denounced them earlier. And, it's a little bit like reading about the Salem witch trials. You see how disturbingly easy it is for local communities to fracture, and for loyalties, friendships, to disappear. And you also see amazing acts of courage on the part of people that you don't actually think are very heroic, like really crappy police officers who've tortured people at some point are like, my brother's a good guy, so screw you. And, and they're aware they're going to, like, be arrested and be tortured themselves. But, like, they finally get to a point where they do something noble. And so anyway, I guess I'm going on and on. I just think it's a great question. And I think that, first of all, it's very difficult to judge any individual's actions in perfect black and white terms. And I know there's exceptions. And I know that if you've been touched by violence yourself, it's very hard to hear that. But I think that looking at things overly simplistically is dangerous. And I think, especially for those of us who are not involved in the fighting. I mean, if you're Ukrainian and your relatives are in the struggle and you've lost your home, that is one thing. But for us Americans, we don't know how we would act. I mean, we don't know how we would act if we were Russians. My heart also goes out to our Russian colleagues who emigrated. And I think a lot about having a greater sympathy for Germans in Weimar Germany, like, which was a very progressive place. Like, say, if you were a professor in Berlin in 1935, I mean, in a lot of ways, that's like a great job. What if you don't speak English? I mean, you're going to give up everything just because some crazy person is in power? No, you think, like, the system is going to correct itself, right? And you don't want your kids to, like, suddenly be impoverished and you have nowhere to go, and maybe you have to do menial tasks somewhere if you can even get a visa, so you stick with it, and suddenly it's too late and you're sucked in, and you don't want to be seen as a perpetrator, and like, these things do take on a logic of their own. Mm-hmm. I have so much sympathy for that now, and I just hope that I would have had the character, to also leave, but I don't know. And I think many Americans are very, very likely to retreat into the private sphere when a challenge like that comes. So I want to encourage empathy and humility.
So I want to follow up on that question. And I have to say, first off, like I have a really hard time finding that right now. I'll just be perfectly honest. I do. Uh, I think I've spent a lot of time saying, well, you know, the Russians that I know, the friends that I have, whom I've mostly, of course, met through this profession, you know, they on the whole have left, or they do oppose the war, and they have done so publicly. People that I've worked with in the past, some incredible people who have tried for years to stand up against the Putin regime. It's harder for me, I think, with the people that I don't know. And so I just want to express that, just to be perfectly honest. You know, I mean, I read and I look at the pictures of what I saw over the weekend, and it's so horrific. So I'm saying it's easier for us as historians, I think. And I try very hard, actually, in my classes to teach the concept of historical empathy, of trying to not always to sympathize, right, but to empathize, to understand how people experienced particular times and places in history, and not to assume that we would automatically be on the side of right and righteousness ourselves. And I think what you're saying is really important there, and I think it's a lesson for all of us as we go forward ourselves into very uncertain times. I think in the coming years, that we be among those who are willing to stand up and to fight. But let me read a question that's right on this subject from one of the students in my class. Paul Abushan writes, I read someone express recently that Russians will only care more about the war in Ukraine when luxury consumer goods disappear from St. Petersburg and Moscow. Do you agree with this indictment of Russian society? And then he asks, why do people retreat into a private sphere when faced with atrocities committed by their government?
Very, very powerful question. I also have been really disappointed. I mean, with people's actions. I mean, with the failure of Russians, just like millions of Russians, not to take to the streets. I will say, though, that if you have very little trust in your ability to influence political change, right? I mean, if there is no social trust, it's a little bit different to think about going out and protesting in that kind of circumstance than it is here. Yes, I think most people are really only pushed to like demonstrating against armed power if there's, you know, real economic hardship. I mean, there's bread riots and people demonstrating and hunger have been, you know, part of history. And I have to say also that I talked to some friends this weekend who haven't left, and so I have mixed groups of people, and they're getting upset. They're in St. Petersburg, but they say, you know, it's just unbelievable how normal things feel here. So there's not even shortages. There was only the single shortage was apparently like a government temporary shortfall in like bleaching agent for paper. Like, so this paper mill that supplies the government with paper, like couldn't send out white paper. So it was like yellow paper for a few weeks. But they even resolved that. But in terms of like restaurants being open and cafes and flower festivals, that's all going on. And if you don't want to hear about the mass graves in Izum, you don't have to. And that is another thing, you know, understanding how propaganda works on subjects isn't as straightforward as we had once maybe assumed. And there is all of this almost like psychological investigation that shows that even when you know you're like listening to a lie, if it's something you want to believe, it still like can influence how you think and how you see the world, right? People really want to believe certain things, and so they're able to kind of, they're being manipulated, but still be manipulated. So that's an element as well. And I think that what I was saying in my talk, this idea that this belief that like, yeah, it's probably worse than what we're seeing, but it's not nearly as bad as what the West is portraying. That is very widespread. This idea that like our soldiers could not be doing that. Like this is staged. Like that's where there's just like kind of a hard line. And I will say that even like these educated people, like they're like doctors and teachers, they're thinking about emigrating, but they're like really worried about Russophobia and asking questions like, are people like attacking Russians in the street? And these are knowledgeable people with VPNs and, and language skills. So it's very difficult to have a good answer to that question.
Yeah. Let me turn to a more strictly historical question, or a question in a way I think about historical memory. Samantha Messina, also in my class, wrote on our discussion boards in the class for today, asking what role does Russian citizens' nostalgia for the Soviet Union play in their support of Vladimir Putin? And somebody else, and I've lost the name because we have so many questions coming in right now, but somebody else also asked to what extent communism is something that is present in Putin's Russia. And so maybe both of them together a little bit, I think that question of nostalgia for the Soviet Union and the question of communism.
Well, it's interesting. I really think that nostalgia for the Soviet Union is tiny. I mean, it's just old people. And what's very interesting about this is that, Putin regime is not anti-capitalist in the slightest. I mean, your other questioner was asking about luxury goods. I mean, these people are like, they're inventing their own substitutes for McDonald's and Starbucks. I mean, I think Starbucks is now like Star Coffee or something like that, but people want to go out and get coffee. Like, and Putin, by the way, is very determined to have salaries be paid, right? He doesn't want to, do whatever he can to like keep people like having money so that they can like actually, go out and buy stuff. I think something, two things. I think that in countries where I've traveled a lot, like, and that includes Kazakhstan, when I've talked to students, like your own students, privileged students, and asked them about what it's like to live under a dictatorship, if they, worry about censorship and stuff, they're pretty hard boiled. I mean, they're like, well, we understand that there's like censorship, but as long as we're allowed to like watch everything except Borat online and, have a chance to get educated and have better jobs than our parents did, and maybe be able to like get a nice car and go to Italy on vacation, like that's enough. We don't have to have like some kind of perfect system of civil liberties. Like this is what it means to live a good private life, and we're good with that. The other thing though about Putin's regime is that, and one of the things that I think makes this like as anti-Western component like so kind of formidable is that it doesn't really have like a coherent vision of Russian history. You could see that in like the anniversary of 1917 and stuff. I mean, it takes, or in the Sochi Olympics opening festival, it takes a little bit here and a little bit there. And if you like, the Natasha opera scene and the world of the aristocrats and Tolstoy's War and Peace, then you can have that Russia. If you like, socialist constructivism and like, the Malevich paintings that Steve and I both have in the background, well, that can be your Russia. And, and if you like just like general superiority in science and technology and military might, then that can be your Russia. It's kind of like imagine your own Russia. And it really doesn't have lots of like singularly unifying features, except for the person of Putin and this idea that like Russia is fighting back against the West.
Let me turn a little bit. So you have spent a lot of time, I know, watching Russian television, reading Russian newspapers online, trying to sort of follow how this war is being talked about and being covered there. And I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit. So a couple of different questions. Let me start with this one. So one of my students and I have been emailing back and forth a lot this week around the question of whether what Russia has been doing, especially when we see things like the a discovery of these mass graves in Izium, whether the word genocide is a word that applies. And I'm gonna, rather than ask you about the topic of genocide, what I want to ask you about is Russian media, because one of the questions that always comes up around the question of genocide is the question of intent. And intent among those who are arguing that this does qualify as genocide is often being pulled out of articles in Russian state-supported media. And so to what extent do you think that the opinions written in the press or the statements of government officials beyond Putin, say, can be ascribed to sort of government intention and government policy more generally? Obviously, if you watch the clips from nighttime Russian television shows, these TV talk shows, Solovyov and their ilk, I mean, it's just absolutely grossly disgusting, barbaric. I mean, I don't even know how many bad words I can throw out there for it. The kinds of things that they say about the need to kill 2 million Ukrainians and things like this. So how do we relate to that? How do we relate to the media in a space where media is as significantly controlled as it is in Russia today? How do we interpret the relationship between that media and what we see on that media and sort of the Putin regime and what it's looking to do and what it wants?
Well, I mean, this is a concern of recent days, right? Because with these spectacular advances of the Ukrainian military, everybody is really waiting and watching to see how Russia responds, right? Because I mean, people are learning that there have been defeats. I mean, there's been an acknowledgement in the media for the first time that some things aren't going well. And I mean, they refer to Ukrainian hordes. So they use the word, horde, like the Mongol horde, Ukrainian hordes armed with like US technology or shooting at our loyal forces kind of thing, demonizing the enemy. But more to the point is that a lot of people are worried that Putin, I mean, there's a good aspect to this, which is that Putin is looking vulnerable. And it seems like this could be a moment where protests of all kinds could actually ignite. But on the other hand, people have pointed out that a lot of that protest, the most vehement protest, is actually coming from those kind of who have more extreme rhetoric than even Putin, right? And that's like Alexander Dugin, whose daughter was assassinated recently, and people like Solovyov that you've just mentioned. I think that the Kremlin hasn't minded having people utter much more sort of vitriolic patriotic rhetoric, because it can make Putin look like a moderate by not going so far or by not replicating perfectly such vocabulary. But people right now have like a real question, like, well, if Putin goes, I mean, I heard this again from like several Russians I talked to over the weekend. If Putin goes, what if we get somebody worse? And what if these like racist ideas are really taking root? Again, I believe it's sort of unscientific, and I know I'm maybe like pulling the wool over my eyes deliberately. I believe that like the majority of Russian society, this like passive majority, are not do not want to exterminate the Ukrainians. I think there's a much broader acceptance of the idea that this idea of the Ukrainian as separate from and in opposition to Russian identity, that is artificially imported from the West. That's something like the West has, agitated for and stirred up, and that there's an artificiality to that. That, I believe, is a very widespread opinion. But this idea that like all Ukrainians should be exterminated, I don't think is a majority view, but I don't want it to be. So that shapes that. And one more thing is that I do think we see this terrible, terrible situation that maybe happens in all wars, but the more violence happens, the greater the acceptance of violence is. I mean, that's something we saw in the run up to the Holocaust and the final solution as well, right? I mean, once the unthinkable starts to happen, like then it becomes normalized. And you certainly see, like, at least at the front, like the viciousness that's sanctioned, and the fact that like Russian soldiers are experiencing viciousness, from above, but like, it's the system of like, kill or be killed. And there's a lack of consequences for people conducting massacres. And this just encourages more massacres and greater social acceptance of them.
So let's turn to the question that you brought up a bit of Russia going forward. Let's assume that Ukraine wins this war, which I feel pretty confident about exactly what that victory is going to look like and how long it will take and how many people will suffer between here and there is, of course, a lot of terrifying questions. I think that Russia losing this war has to happen for there to be a possibility of a better Russia. But one of our questioners brings up the comparison of denazification and says that denazification in Germany could only happen following the outright defeat of Hitler. And I don't think we see the likelihood here that Ukraine's not marching to Moscow, right? And so we don't see the kind of total defeat that we saw in Germany at the end of the Second World War. So what could a de-Putinization look like in this kind of context? And I did have somebody also ask, why should the West or the US not aim to disassemble Russia permanently, either explicitly or as a matter of clandestine policy? This is certainly something there have been not a lot of voices saying this in Washington, D.C. policy circles, but there are a few.
Wow, there's an idea.
So I'm just curious, kind of your thoughts of, where that future is. You encourage us to draw lessons from the mistakes, perhaps, of 1992, 93, 94, 96, especially you talked about. So is there something that we can say more specifically about what we maybe think that the United States should do, or what we might imagine could come for Russia? I know it's a complicated question, and we as historians, as I always like to say, hate to try to predict the future. But I'm just curious your thoughts on it.
Oh, I worry about this all the time. Like, I don't see how this works out. I mean, obviously, there also has to be regime change in Russia. But then again, I mean, there's not like a leader supporting, there's not like Barack Obama Smirnov, like just in the wings, ready to go, and even the one kind of dissident that's recognized in the West, Alexei Navalny is in the gulag, and he didn't have mass popular support. I think there are two huge problems here. Again, so I'm just going to like list problems and not solutions. I mean, it's a terrible problem. I mean, I don't see a division of Russia like really happening. I mean, China would just get like what, 3/4 of it. I'm not sure that, whatever, that's fun to talk about, but like it doesn't seem in the short term like that real. I mean, unless maybe something really terrible happens and everybody gets involved, and there is this kind of outside kind of involvement in reorganizing Russia. How to do that if Russia is not going to be attacked. So the maximal like military victory for Ukraine would be just like retaking all of the territory that was originally Ukraine, but not going further. I don't know. I mean, I actually see a problem there. And one is that, you know, if there isn't some kind of outside intervention into Russia, and really like a protracted kind of development effort or something like positive as well as punitive, I don't see how you don't end up with like Germany after World War I, like a nation that has this memory of being like internationally humiliated and maybe like penalized and making payments, because I mean, Ukraine deserves repayments. I mean, this is atrocious, like no denying that, but then you got a whole generation of people that are being raised as just like resentful and ashamed and angry. And that seems pretty scary. And, you know, and then the other thing is that, God, what is the other thing? I'm forgetting. It's just that, I don't know. We have to make, oh yeah, we have to make democratic values look good to Russians, but we're also going to be facing, and this is something for you children who are, I'm sorry, students who are younger than me, but I think it's going to be a real challenge for all of us, even outside this conflict in the years to come. And that is like our dedication to democracy. And what is that exactly? Because there is a problem. And I also found myself when I was writing this paper, having a lot of sympathy for Bill Clinton, you know, in 1996 too. Sometimes people freaking want to elect the wrong candidates. This is ironically something that Stalin struggled with a lot. From his point of view, whenever he had local elections, you know, these stupid Soviet citizens like didn't want to elect the communists. And so he kept like canceling local elections and running them over. But I mean, this is a problem. If you believe in a certain set of values, and like we call them, say, democratic values, what happens when in a national community, like people elect to lead them candidates that, you know, don't embrace any of that? And that's what I see. I mean, we can also preach democracy, but be aware that like democracy in Russia is for like a good long time, unless we start packaging like our system differently somehow. Like a democratic voting process in Russia is not going to lead to like the election of like fine, noble people from our point of view.
Yeah. Cynthia, thank you so much. We literally have 47 questions in the Q&A.
I'm so sorry.
No, there's just no way. So let me just say a couple of things to close here. First off, let's continue the conversation. I know you and I will, we always do. But for other folks, join us on Twitter, hashtag RWOU. You can ask more questions. We can have conversations and discussion and takeaways from what Cynthia has told us today. Second thing I wanted to mention, a lot of people mentioned in the Q&A, and Cynthia and I were laughing when we first turned on our Zoom, that we both just happened to have the exact
We
same
did not plan
Casimir
it.
Malevich.
No, we did not.
I mean, it tells you something, I think, about what it is that got people like us interested in this part of the world. But I think actually it also says something that's important for us to keep in mind, and it will bring us into who's coming next week. Casimir Malevich originally comes from Kiev, Ukraine. He is born from ethnic Polish parents, and yet he is frequently referred to as a Russian avant-garde artist. And that, I think, raises a lot of questions for us in thinking about how we talk about and think about Russia and Ukraine in the long run historically. So I want to invite you all to come back and join us next week. We have coming what I would say is perhaps one of the greatest historians of Ukraine alive today. Serhiy Plokhy is coming. He is at Harvard University. He has written more books than I can possibly count. I don't even know if I can count them on both hands. He's an amazing scholar, an amazing speaker. As I was preparing to teach my own class, I learned a lot from various talks that he's given over the years. And he's going to come and talk to us the return of history, the Russo-Ukrainian War through the eyes of a historian. And we'll do that next week at 3 p.m. I hope many of you will come. I hope you'll tell your friends and family and colleagues and everybody in your communities to come and join us as well for these important conversations. Thank you again, Cynthia Hooper from the College of the Holy Cross. Thank you, Jessica Dautrieve, for helping me in the background. And I'll see everybody next week. Thanks.